What is the priority, trade or politics, Mr. Yang?
Of course, trade and investment.
Only because it's easier?
No, because of the top priority or top interests for both of the sides benefiting from the bilateral relations.
What do you think, Professor?
I think basically right. The basic idea is trade is important, but for Malcolm Turnbull, who is a businessman, trade and politics cross over all the time. He's very China literate, and therefore he sees the relationship between trade and politics to be strongly important. So I think they're intertwined in his mind.
Let's talk about politics a little bit, because it might be hard to talk about it, and then let's put it in the front. Disputes in the South China Sea. Of course, that also attracted the attention of Australia. Australia sometimes takes sides, apparently, from the Chinese perspective. Other times, Australia seems to be quite relaxed. What exactly is Australia's position? Is the Prime Minister likely to raise the issue of South China Sea and territorial disputes? What would that mean eventually for the nature of relations between these two countries? Professor McCarthy.
I think he's trying to steer a course between China and America on this regard. He's developed a sort of formula that tries to say that we're not intervening in this process. But he's doing it through his own background, which is a legal background, and he sort of says, if we can only get the legal order right, and if China would only agree with the legal order, then it will be fine. But he doesn't see China's point of view, which is that this is a sovereignty issue, not a legal issue. So I think he's trying to steer a course that China won't understand, and that this difference between cultures, difference between our political systems, will cause problems.
Legal system for whom? Of course, that's a eligible question, I guess, Mr. Yang coming from China. And secondly, if China looks at it as a territorial issue of its own, then it's a very different nature we are talking about. We all know international law have different clauses. All the countries who try to claim the territory could go to different clauses of the international law. Therefore, is the legal system Professor McCarthy talked about, which is the Prime Minister might subscribe to, really going to be the eligible one?
Well, I think Australia and other Western countries, especially the United States, take a very selective and double standard-like terms regarding to the legal system. For example, if we talk about rule of law of South China Sea, I would say first thing first for Philippines is they should go back to their constitution stemmed from the two U.S.-Spain treaties plus U.S.-Britain treaties. Those three treaties exactly define the boundary lines of the whole Philippine Islands. For example, we talk about Huangyan Islands, and according to Philippines constitution, the very clear definition is their farthest eastern boundary line is in the 118 degree, but the Huangyan Island is far from that degree. So if they really talk about the rule of law, just return to your constitution. They claimed they were the first founder of the island in 1956.
Right, we could go into details about all of these islands one by one. Of course, these are all very important principles when it comes to countries in the territorial disputes. But what would that mean for Australia's awkwardness, in a way, to be this go-betweener or the one who has to take a position if being asked? What exactly is Australia's agenda out of this, Professor McCarthy?
I think Malcolm Turnbull is quite astute at this. He's not trying to go down the agenda which the Americans want him to go down, which is to send in a warship and to play a different kind of public game. He's trying to simply say, let The Hague have a look at it. It gives him space, particularly as it's building up towards an election, not to follow the Americans in this path. So it actually gives him an out, the legal position gives him an out not to be seen taking sides.
But Australia did participate in the military exercises involving Australia, the Philippines, and the United States, of course. And recently, we have also been hearing Australia, for example, last year, a dispute in Darwin. Of course, many American military are still based there. It's supposed to be one of those bases in the Asia-Pacific region for the U.S. There is a dispute between China and Australia about whether Australia could sell certain port to the Chinese when it comes to operation rights. So all of these are interestingly intertwined, the politics and the economic issues.
Yes.
Professor McCarthy, it seems that it's something that Australia cannot escape. Australia has to have a clear understanding of where it is.
I think you're right. There's a certain subtlety that
Yes, indeed.
the Prime Minister has, which Australia has yet to catch up with, I think. He's sort of arguing something different than some of the previous Prime Ministers, and that he's arguing is that perhaps in 20 years' time, Asia will be quite distinctly different. He sees India rising rapidly, he sees Indonesia growing, and he sees China having the prominent role in Asia. Then that raises a question he sort of puts on the table about what will happen in 20 years' time in regards to America. And so he's offering quite a distinctly different position than his predecessors. I think he's seeing that the power balance is shifting, and he continually uses the parable that Xi Jinping used about we shouldn't worry about the rise of China the same way that Sparta worried about the rise of Athens. So he uses that metaphor to say we shouldn't worry.
Mr. Yang, we've seen various expressions of politics coming from quite distinctive administration in Australia. And by the way, your administration changes very fast.
Yes, we've
Over
had
the
7 in
past
5
10
years or something. Yes, we have.
and so you see very different positions coming from different administrations at different times.
Yep.
So what is China's understanding of where Australia is vis-a-vis China's position in the Asia-Pacific region? Is Australia having a persuading power, or at least a partnership power with China, not only on the business and economic side, but also in terms of the territorial issues, in terms of the political issues?
Well, I think Australia, although it's a European-based or Western-styled country, is more and more like an Asian country. In Asia, several countries are divided by economic and political considerations between the China and the U.S. positions. And by the same token, Australia now is, when they think about economic factors, they take China in more consideration, and vice versa, more Americans whenever they talk about politics or security issues. So this divided position always make Australian administration something swing this end and the other end. But in line, I don't think different administration has a sharply different positions towards the Asia Pacific. Look, Australia is one of the major founding members of APEC. And back to 1990s, Australia has determined to turn their strategic focus towards Asia rather than to the Europe. So since then, each Australian administration make a focus on the Asia. That's the major trends. But along the trends, political and economic, they always swing between the major powers.
Well,
So that's
talking
the
about
problem.
those pendulum, let's take a look at what exactly one end of the pendulum is, which is the economic and trade ties. If you look at the investment coming from Australia, partly because analysts believe Australia has a relatively stable economic environment over the years. Take a look at this. Australia has been China's second most favored outbound investment destination since the year 2005. China beefed up investments into Australia in the year 2015 by 1/3 in US dollar terms and a more stunning 60% in Aussie dollar terms. This exactly is one of those areas in which China and Australia work together in terms of trade and economic ties. How much will that mean for Australia's own economy and its own economic transformation?
I think there's two things going on that you mentioned before. The complementarity between Australia and China has been really strong. When China had its 5-year plan to grow through investment and infrastructure, then Australia benefited by iron ore and coal sales. Now China's changed its position to be much more qualified investment. Its investments around the world are really strategically clever at the moment, much cleverer than they have been for a long time, and that's true in Australia. They've shifted from real estate and mining into investments into commerce, health, renewable energies. And so you're seeing complementarity in a different way, and that's why the trade mission here of 1,000 business people are all about showing the new complementarity between China shifting towards a consumer-led economy and Australia being very strong about consumer services. So that's where the new complementarity is on about. And you can see this in the way China's investment in, say, real estate in Sydney's occurred. It's shifted from housing into commerce, hotels, property that relates to the way China's heading, particularly the tourist industry. Those people are buying hotels so Chinese tourists can go and stay in them.
Well, all of these sounds beautiful, but Professor McCarthy, as you have heard from Mr. Yang earlier, China is quite confused about this divide of mentality inside Australia, for example. When it comes to trade and economic ties, go to China. When it comes to political and also territorial issues, let's go to another different direction. So, but according to the Chinese, the economics and politics sometimes intertwine with one another, and it has to, because that's where confidence comes from towards one another. So how does that work for Australia? Will that be a long-term strategy? Long-term, will it work?
In some senses, economics drives politics in an old way. There's a famous saying in Australia that in some senses, economics drives politics. In China, politics drives economics, which is both true and false. But in Australia, the sense in which economics is driving politics, you can see that in the example you showed before in regard to the Darwin ports. America complained about the leasing of the ports to the Chinese, but the Australians agreed with it. So that shifted politics. You could see that in regards to the Asia Investment Bank. The politics were follow America, no, we're going to follow our own level. So I think economics in Australia is driving politics.
Interesting to talk about the AIIB. Everyone believes it is certainly an economic and trade issue, but at the same time, geopolitics from the very beginning comes into play. Mr. Yang, I still remember very well when the Australian side announced to join the AIIB. Everybody took it as a big surprise. It was during the Boao Forum.
Yes.
Last year.
Oh yes, last year the finance minister made a very.
You were there.
I was there, and I didn't expect. Originally, the foreign minister, their embassy here, come to the organizer of the annual conference, say their foreign minister wanted to join in a session regarding to AIIB. Of course, organizer were happy and invited the foreign minister be there, but never expect they will make some breaking news. They indicate that Australia has decided to join in the AIIB, but at that time, majority believed because of the American intervention, Australia government would not join in the AIIB, but they did. So take this case in my theory. I mentioned always swings politically and economically. Practically speaking, when an issue is really pure economic issue, obviously, certainly go to China. A pure security or political go to US. However, if the issue relating both the economic and political, then the disputes not a problem to China, but the problem neither to US, neither to China, but the problem to Australia. They say economically AIIB should be beneficial, but politically should be benefit for China. So oppose or support, then they have a dispute. And you and China look and wait till their decision.
Right. Well, Professor McCarthy was laughing out loud when you were saying the textbook principle, it seems. Tell me, Professor, about that internal debate inside your country regarding AIIB. There was a lot of debate about that before the announcement was being made. And now, 1 year later, how do people look at that decision? And what can be the implication of this specific decision for future China and Australia ties?
You have to think about Australia as divided in some senses in defence terms, and that there are people in Canberra who have a very strong pro-Washington position and the people who are more neutral. The debate in Australia over the AIIB had to deal with the fact that President Obama rang up Prime Minister Abbott at the time and said, don't join. but the financial arm of the state said join. So the people who'd run finances, economics, the people who turned up at the forum, drove the agenda and won the debate inside the cabinet, and that includes the Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, who was able to win that case. So there's always divisions, and there are strong, loud voices in Canberra that want to push the Washington position, and there are those who are seeing a different position, not both economically but politically. We have to shift.
Yes, indeed. But what about the other areas when it comes to economically? For example, the banking sector these days seems to be an interesting story, ever evolving between China and Australia. Meanwhile, iron ore has always been a big export item from Australia to China, but China's economy has been going through this transformation, much less investment on the internal building in a way, more on consumption. So that has a big impact on all of these raw materials, of course, Australia being affected. So how have those areas been? What will Australia rely on when it comes to future attractiveness to China economically?
I think it's the way in which the Prime Minister presents it is this innovation economy. He sees in China the sense in which China is really moving in an innovative way, particularly with high technology, faster than Australia is. And you only need to look at the use of the mobile phone in China to be much greater in Australia and the way it's used. And he sees that as complementarity, that we can help there. Secondly, he sees both societies have got an ageing population. We're very good at aged care. We offer high quality services in a variety of ways that China could benefit from. So he sees that as important. Education, quite clearly. We have 115,000 Chinese students there as I speak. So education is important. He sees the same language that Xi Jinping uses in terms of innovation. He uses the same language. He thinks the complementarity will work because of consumer-led positions on both sides.
Mr. Yang, certainly we can learn some lifestyles from Australia.
Oh, yes.
Much more laid out down under.
Yeah. Well, I think there are obviously different advantages between the two sides, and especially in terms of the innovations, both sides has the share the same focuses, but with different advantages. So I think the economic ties will be more diversified and a wider range of the cooperation and the potential for the economic ties.
All right. We've been talking about the brilliant side of economic and trade ties, but I have to, as a journalist, always go to some of the other areas. Once again, I want to remind you before we wrap up today's show, because we all understand very well this world, politics